The war had already displayed odd differences, but the captured Germans were most surprised to learn that many of the American Jeeps driving all over Europe were made by women, not men. To soldiers who grew up where industry was for fathers and sons, this discovery seemed unbelievable. When American Jeeps started showing up everywhere, German soldiers thought these small, tough vehicles were just another example of U.S. mass production led by male workers in Detroit and Toledo. The Jeep seemed like it could not be destroyed, light enough to move fast, strong enough to hold a group of soldiers, and easy to fix in the field. By 1944, it was a symbol of how well the Allies moved. To German soldiers used to horses pulling carts in their supply lines, the Jeep looked like a machine from the future. But the bigger shock came later when intelligence reports and magazines in POW camps showed that most of these vehicles, about 500,000, had been put together by women. To understand why this was such a surprise, you have to think about the culture back then. In Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s, women were told to stay in traditional roles at home. The Nazi Party praised them as mothers and homemakers. Most heavy industry was seen as not right, even risky for them. Even though the Third Reich eventually brought women into war jobs because they needed them, the government never celebrated women working in factories like America did. German soldiers who had seen propaganda pictures before crossing the Atlantic expected to see tall buildings and fancy cars, but never women in work clothes, using drills, welding torches, or riveting guns. The United States, however, reacted to Pearl Harbor by getting everyone involved. Millions of men were drafted, leaving jobs in factories that needed to be filled. The government started a big campaign to get women to work in factories, saying it was their patriotic duty. Rosie the Riveter, with her sleeve rolled up and determined look, quickly became a famous symbol. Behind the posters were real women, many of them young, who had never been inside a factory before 1941. But in a few months, they learned the machines, making trucks, tanks, airplanes, and especially jeeps. For the Germans who saw this, they felt both disbelief and fear. If America could not only get its men ready for war, but also its women ready for factories, then its industrial power seemed endless. Reports went around among captured officers that Ford and Willys factories were running all day and night, often with women working there. Some German prisoners who worked in U.S. plants with guards during the war saw it themselves. Women tightening bolts, putting engines in place, and driving finished jeeps off the line to be checked. They noticed how fast and accurate the work was, something hard to imagine in German factories, which still relied on male apprenticeships and strict rules. The Jeep became a symbol of women's work power. Light, able to do many things, and everywhere. It went with Allied armies to North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes. German soldiers joked sadly that every time they destroyed one, 3 more showed up, like the Americans had plenty of them. They did not know that the secret was in Detroit and Toledo, where women were making vehicles very quickly. This news spread slowly but surely in Red Cross magazines, in talks with American guards, and later by seeing it for themselves. German prisoners put the truth together. It was not just a story. It was real. The shock of seeing women in charge of making 500,000 jeeps meant more than just numbers. It showed a totally different society, where women were trusted with war industry tools, and where what men and women could do was changed by what was needed. To German soldiers, it felt like finding a secret weapon, an invisible force behind the Allied armies that could not be bombed, surrounded, or run out of. Detroit in the early 1940s did not look like the city that had been known for making cars for fun. Called the Motor City, it had been known for its shiny showrooms, loud test tracks, and the famous names of Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. But when America joined the war after December 1941, President Roosevelt's government demanded that making cars for people stop. Factories that had been making shiny cars and convertibles suddenly went quiet, only to start up again with a totally different purpose, the purpose of war. German observers reading intelligence reports, or hearing about it later when they were captured, had trouble understanding how big this change was. Entire lines were cleared of their car equipment and replaced with heavy tools for military vehicles. By 1942, Detroit had become the place that made weapons for democracy, a huge area where factories no longer sold dreams of luxury, but made the equipment that Allied armies needed. The change was not just in what was being made, but in who was making it. With millions of men drafted, the large spaces of River Rouge and Toledo Jeep plants started filling with women. These women, many of them wives, daughters, or even mothers of soldiers overseas, had never thought they would work in factories. But they stepped up, joining quick classes that taught them how to use welders, drill presses, and torque wrenches. In weeks, women who had been shop clerks or housekeepers could put together axles, cut metal sheets, or rivet body panels with amazing accuracy. The urgency of war meant there was not much time to hesitate, and mistakes had to be fixed right away. Supervisors quickly learned that things did not slow down when women filled the jobs. In fact, production often went faster than expected. Detroit's change was not just about vehicles. Aircraft engines, tank parts, machine guns, and ammunition were made in the same places. But the Jeep stood out because there were so many of them. To the German General Staff, the news that America was making vehicles so fast while their own factories were always being stopped by bombing campaigns was almost unbelievable. In one U.S. plant, Jeeps were rolling off the line every 2 minutes, going to North Africa or the Pacific. When German prisoners later saw photos of these big halls full of women tightening bolts or putting engines into frames, they saw something totally different from their own industrial culture. The environment inside these factories was a study in contrasts. Heat from welding torches made the air wavy while the noise of steel echoed across large assembly halls. Posters with sayings like, "Do the job he left behind," reminded workers why they were there. Safety patrols taught women how to protect themselves from sparks and heavy lifting accidents. Many women wore their hair tied back in scarves or tucked under caps, practical choices that later became famous fashion symbols. These details fascinated German prisoners, who found American magazines showing smiling women behind the steering wheels of new Jeeps with captions proudly announcing daily output, numbers that were close to Germany's monthly totals. What shocked Germans most was not just the mechanical success, but the cultural flip in their country. Even as things got really bad, the Nazi government hesitated to bring women into factories in large numbers, worried it would ruin traditional roles. But in Detroit and across the United States, women were not only asked, but praised for their industrial work. The American home front became an extension of the battlefield, and Detroit became a fortress of production. To Germans who thought of the automobile as the best of male invention, the idea that hundreds of thousands of Jeeps had been touched, put together, and tested by women was both amazing and deeply upsetting. The image of American women taking on factory jobs was not just numbers or government reports. It became something you could see and feel in the culture. Photos went around in newspapers showing women in denim work clothes, protective goggles on their faces, sleeves rolled up, and hands covered in grease. These women were not just at secretarial desks or in kitchens. They were welding frames, aligning gearboxes, and riveting steel plates on vehicles going to far-off battlefields. To a German officer used to women shown as mothers in villages or as background people in propaganda posters, this was very confusing. Inside Jeep assembly plants, the daily work looked like scenes from a world the Germans had never known. Women arrived before sunrise, their lunchboxes making noise as they checked in at time clocks, then went into big halls filled with the loud noise of machines. Production lines stretched for hundreds of feet, with vehicles moving forward in time with each other. At one station, a team of women riveters hammered panels into place with rhythmic accuracy. At another, mechanics lowered engines into frames using overhead cranes while inspectors, often also women, measured torque, fuel lines, and brake fittings. Break times were short, often spent near lockers, drinking coffee before going back to the constant pace of industrial warfare. The shock for Germans was not just seeing women doing hard jobs, but how they did it with pride and confidence. Many German prisoners later said in their stories and interviews that they had never been prepared to see women using welding torches or balancing on platforms above armored vehicles. In Germany, even during the worst years of bombing and shortages, Propaganda kept saying that women's best work was at home, raising children, or helping in small ways. To see them in America, controlling huge machines and organizing production shifts, went against deeply held beliefs about gender and work. Equally surprising was how these women were celebrated. Hollywood news clips showed them smiling next to the Jeeps they built. Their names were sometimes written on signs as the crew behind the wheels of victory. Wartime posters went around every town, turning the factory worker into a symbol of national pride. When German soldiers in captivity saw these things, often provided by camp libraries or Red Cross bulletins, they could not connect them with what they knew about women's roles in their own society. Instead of being hidden, American women were made into symbols of productivity, their work openly seen as important. It was not just propaganda, though, it was results. The Jeeps they built reached the front in huge numbers. American units landing in Sicily or Normandy relied on them to carry supplies, move wounded, and stay in touch across rough land. For German troops watching these small vehicles move quickly across battlefields, it was hard to believe that they had been put together in such numbers by people they would have thought of as unskilled or delicate workers. But photos and people who saw it confirmed it. Women did not just fill the jobs left by drafted men. They learned the industrial processes and made them faster. The cultural difference was big. German society of the 1930s had shown women as protectors of tradition. But in America, they had become builders of the very machines that broke German defenses. The picture of a young woman tightening bolts on a Jeep engine showed a change in social roles, a change that would spread far beyond the war itself. To German prisoners forced to understand these realities, it felt like seeing not just a military loss, but the collapse of a whole way of thinking. Numbers alone often tell the most devastating story, and in the case of the American Jeep, the numbers were hard for German analysts to understand. By the end of the war, the United States had made over 500,000 Jeeps, a huge number that went beyond the combined light vehicle production of several Axis countries. German intelligence officers who had to watch Allied industry kept noting how factories in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania ran all the time, sending a never-ending flow of vehicles to shipping ports. What surprised them most was not just the amount, but how steady the production was. Even with wartime shortages with raw materials going to aircraft and shipbuilding, Jeep lines never slowed down. The amazing thing was the system of mass production improved during the years between wars. Ford's River Rouge plant, Willys Overland in Toledo, and Bantam's facilities became industrial fortresses focused on one thing: making Jeeps at an unmatched speed. At River Rouge, raw materials like iron ore and rubber came in one end of the complex, and finished vehicles came out the other. The genius of the assembly line meant that untrained workers could be put into specific jobs, each responsible for a small but important task. This system let women, many with no technical background, be trained in days or weeks, and immediately help with the process. The vehicles themselves showed the idea of simplicity and efficiency. Made to be tough and easy to fix, the Jeep needed fewer special parts than bigger trucks or tanks. This let factories make assembly procedures standard, which helped production. In wartime reports intercepted by German intelligence, numbers like 18,000 Jeeps in a single month showed up often. For officers trying to figure out Allied logistics, these numbers showed a war effort powered by an almost unlimited industrial base. The size of the logistics chain further showed the achievement. Once Jeeps came off assembly lines, they were loaded onto trains, sent to coastal docks, and packed onto Liberty ships going to Africa, Europe, or the Pacific. German submarines sank thousands of merchant ships. But the supply of Jeeps never seemed to stop. Even in North Africa, where the land was rough and vehicles broke down a lot, new replacements arrived so often that U.S. commanders treated Jeeps almost like things that could be thrown away. German soldiers forced to fix horse carts or reuse captured vehicles found this wasteful abundance hard to understand. For many Germans, the mental blow was worse than the military one. The understanding that an enemy could lose hundreds of Jeeps in a campaign without hurting their ability to move showed industrial power on a level Germany could never reach. The Luftwaffe's bombing raids might hit a single British factory, But America's spread-out system and large workforce, now helped by millions of women, could not be stopped. Where German plants struggled to recover from raids and labor shortages, American lines worked at full speed all the time. The Jeep's constant presence symbolized this difference. It was the command car, the ambulance, the reconnaissance vehicle, and the cargo carrier all in one. In captured diaries of German officers, notes appeared describing the many Jeeps seen in Normandy and during the Ardennes offensive. Each time they destroyed one, several more appeared on the horizon. Only later did these same officers find out that the secret was not in unlimited supplies of men, but in the constant production lines where women replaced them. 500,000 Jeeps showed not just machines, but the visible proof of an industrial miracle that Nazi Germany could never copy. The first sign of disbelief among Germans did not come from battlefields, but from the news getting into prisoner-of-war camps across the United States and Britain. Captured officers and soldiers, already surprised by the amount of food and modern comforts inside camps, soon found magazines and Red Cross bulletins talking about the American home front. In between articles on rationing and victory gardens were photos of women behind the wheels of Jeeps they had built, or standing proudly in front of assembly lines. For men raised in a culture that still expected women to focus on home and family, these images seemed like lies, propaganda made to make them feel bad. But it was not propaganda. The reality became harder to deny as guards and camp staff confirmed the truth. Some German prisoners of war even had to work close to U.S. factories, where they could see many vehicles constantly leaving plants mostly staffed by women. In their letters back home, which were checked but still showed a lot, they wrote about young women welding and putting things together just as well as trained workers. For many of these men, it was a confusing moment. They had been told that America was weak and spoiled. But these women were building the very machines that helped Allied soldiers win. The shock grew when they thought about what they knew from home. In Germany, there was not enough of anything. It was hard to find replacement parts. People used the same tires over and over, and some groups had to use horses to carry supplies. The vehicles that did exist were often saved for officers or special groups. To find out that America had not only enough Jeeps for every group of soldiers, but also extra to give to allies like Britain and the Soviet Union, was upsetting. Prisoners of war shared photos of Red Army soldiers riding in American Jeeps that were sent over through Lend-Lease programs. For the captured Germans, this reminded them not only that they had lost, but that their enemy had factories that reached across the world. What they said in interviews showed how surprised they were. Some officers said the numbers must be wrong, while others said clearly that Germany could not make as much. A common idea in these stories is that they could not imagine German women doing the same jobs. One officer said that if German women were asked to run factories on that scale, Germany would fall apart in a few months. This showed not only that he was biased, but also that Germany's strict rules had stopped it from using all the skills of its people. There was also anger. Some prisoners of war were upset, saying that America's advantage was not real, but came from being safe from bombs and having access to resources from all over the world. But even those reasons did not make sense when they saw that women who were thought not able to do serious work in Germany had become the reason for an amazing increase in production. When prisoners talked to each other, the topic of Jeeps often came up as a symbol of how much America had. They complained that Americans could leave broken Jeeps on the side of the road, while German soldiers fought over fuel for just one truck. For many, the shock stayed with them even after the war. Those who lived through being prisoners and went back to Germany remembered clearly the first time they saw American magazines or visited factories. They told their friends and family that one of the biggest surprises of the war was not the atomic bomb or how many bombs were dropped, but realizing that American women had built hundreds of thousands of Jeeps. They thought it was a clear example of how differently the United States had used its people compared to the strict, traditional rules of Nazi Germany. During the war, Nazi propaganda had shown a very specific picture of America as a country of pleasure, with jazz clubs and distractions from Hollywood, a place that could not keep the discipline needed for a long fight. Women, especially, were shown in a silly way, as shallow, not responsible, and only interested in fashion and parties. But as German prisoners of war saw what the U.S. was really like at home, that carefully made image fell apart. The difference between what they had been told and the photos of women using rivet guns or guiding cranes inside Jeep factories was obvious. It showed that Germany had not only underestimated how much America could produce, but also how easily its society could change. In Germany, the Nazi leaders waited for years before using women in heavy industry. Hitler himself did not want women working in factories because he thought it hurt the idea of women as mothers. Only later in the war, when they really needed more people, were women used more widely, often unwillingly and in bad conditions. Even then, their work was not praised much. It was seen as something that had to be done, not something to be proud of. This was very different from the United States, where women workers were made into symbols of winning. Posters with words like "She's making history," "Working for victory," were hung in cafeterias and union halls, while news programs proudly showed women putting together jeeps that were going to the front. German officers quickly understood the emotional power of this difference. In interviews, some said that America had found a way to use all of its people without hurting morale, while Germany, stuck to its beliefs, kept half of its potential workers not being used. The Jeep became a symbol of this failure, a simple vehicle that showed not only clever engineering, but also the willingness to change social rules for the sake of war. Prisoners who found camp libraries or Red Cross magazines sometimes said these stories were made up. But as time passed, more and more proof appeared. Prisoners of war saw photos of rows of women at welding machines or happy groups delivering jeeps to places where they would be sent, with signs saying "Built by Women of Willys." They also read about times when all-women groups produced more than groups that had both men and women, or mostly men. For Germans who had been taught that women could not handle such hard work, these reports felt like embarrassing proof that the propaganda had failed. The difference became a common topic in camp discussions. Some prisoners argued strongly that German society had been lied to by its leaders, that their unwillingness to fully use women had cost Germany production that it could not replace. Others refused to believe it, saying that America's wealth came only from resources stolen from other countries. But even the most stubborn people could not explain away the 500,000 jeeps that were on every battlefield, or that many of them had been built by women whose work was openly celebrated. For many German prisoners, this realization created a feeling of unease that went beyond the war. It suggested that the world itself was changing, that the strict categories they had grown up with were falling apart under the pressure of total war. To see women not just helping but driving the war machine itself reminded them that Germany's ideas about gender and power were completely outdated. The propaganda had promised that America was weak. The truth was that America's women had become one of its strongest weapons. The change in how German prisoners saw things did not happen right away, but slowly, as seeing undeniable evidence over and over broke down old ideas. Many of these men had grown up in a society where women's work was limited to home, farming, or small office jobs. But in American magazines that were passed around in prisoner of war camps, sometimes official U.S. Army magazines, sometimes donated newspapers, there were pictures of women using lathes, putting together engines, and test driving new jeeps. Each issue they read made them realize more that America's home front worked in a completely different way, one that did not waste any possible workers, whether men or women, while fighting a global war. Prisoners who were moved between camps sometimes shared stories of what they had seen in work assignments. Some had been placed under guard at depots where groups of jeeps arrived, newly painted in olive drab, engines running smoothly, waiting to be sent to places where they would be loaded onto ships. They noticed that these vehicles often had small tags or chalk marks that showed which factory shift had made them, sometimes noting that it was an all-women crew. It was one thing to see a photo in a magazine. It was another to walk past rows of brand-new jeeps and know that thousands like them were being made every week by workers the Germans had thought were not able to do it. The effect on how they saw the world was big. Conversations in barracks sometimes became heated, as men argued about whether German industry might have done better if it had used women in a similar way. Some argued that Germany's unwillingness had been a fatal mistake, while others held on to the belief that Germany's cultural traditions could not be changed, even if it meant being weaker industrially. But in the silence after such arguments, the sight of America's endless vehicles spoke louder than any belief. For some prisoners of war, the shock was almost admiration. In books written after the war, a few said they had been impressed by how the United States had managed to combine patriotism, industrial organization, and equality between men and women, at least for a while, into a united war effort. The Jeep became a good example of this. Unlike tanks or airplanes, which needed a lot of infrastructure, the Jeep showed a product of accuracy and high volume. Its presence everywhere on the battlefield showed how smoothly American society had changed, turning women into producers on a scale that no Axis power had matched. This change in perception also showed itself in small ways. Guards noticed that some German prisoners who at first made fun of the idea of women in industry eventually became quiet when the topic came up. Others even said they wished their own sisters or wives back in Germany had been allowed the same chance to participate, seeing now how important such participation had been in America. For men who had once marched under flags celebrating traditional roles, this realization brought an uncomfortable feeling of defeat, not just in the war, but culturally. The Jeeps themselves reinforced the lesson everywhere. German troops fighting in France or Italy saw so many of the vehicles that they became connected to American mobility. Soldiers learned that behind each Jeep was not only the resources of the U.S., but also the determination of women who had changed their place in society to meet the needs of war. For German prisoners of war thinking about these things, the shock lasted a long time. It was no longer possible to ignore women as unimportant people. They had become, in the American case, key players in how the war turned out. When the war finally ended, and German officers went back to a destroyed homeland, many carried with them memories less of battles than of what they had realized while they were prisoners. Among the most lasting was the discovery that America's amazing production had depended on the work of women. In interviews after the war, technical discussions, and later books, people often mentioned how shocked they were to see women not only replace men who were gone, but do better than expected in jobs that were once thought to be only for men. The Jeep, that small workhorse of the Allied armies, became a quick way to explain this surprise. 500,000 vehicles, each a symbol of a society that had used resources that Germany never dared to use. German industrial experts who studied Allied production after the war had to admit the strategic importance of this use of people. Reports written in 1946 and 1947 by economic groups compared how much the U.S. produced to Germany's broken and damaged system. They noted that while Germany struggled to fix factories after each bombing, America had built backup systems into its production lines, and women kept those lines running without stopping. The conclusion was clear. America had not just produced more than Germany, it had used a completely new workforce to do so, something Germany had not been able to copy. Books written by captured officers often showed a more personal reaction. Some said that seeing pictures of women in overalls in camp magazines had been as surprising as the first time they saw Jeeps on the battlefield. Others admitted they had a reluctant respect, realizing that American society had shown a flexibility that Germany's strict beliefs had prevented. In stories written years later, phrases like a hidden army or the invisible force were used to describe the women who had built Jeeps, planes, and tanks. The emotional impact of this discovery lasted long after the fighting stopped. The impact went beyond just military analysis. German civilians who had never seen America were surprised when returning prisoners of war described what they had learned. Wives and daughters who had suffered through bombing raids and not having enough food listened as men told stories of American women who not only worked in safe factories far from the front, but also earned money and were recognized for their work. These comparisons led to discussions in Germany after the war about gender roles, modernization, and what they had learned from losing. Even many years later, historians would say that the Jeep was more than just a vehicle. It was a cultural symbol. It stood for mobility, reliability, and cooperation between allies, but also the success of a society that had changed work and gender roles under the pressure of global conflict. For the Germans, who had once laughed at the idea of women in heavy industry, The realization was humbling. America had proved that winning was not only about armies in the field, but also about being willing to break old rules. So the surprise that started in prisoner-of-war camps and on battlefields did not go away with time. It became part of the bigger story of why Germany lost and why America's power grew so quickly after the war. 500,000 Jeeps built by the hands of women remained in memory as one of the most important, if unexpected, forces of the Second World War. For the Germans who saw it, the shock never completely disappeared. It reminded them that in war sometimes the strongest weapon is the society that changes the fastest.